Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising. As we consider the death of Alexei Navalny on the occasion of his funeral, which is taking place actually right now in Moscow, began a couple hours ago and is continuing. And more broadly, we'll be discussing the war in Ukraine and the latest developments. Before we do that, as we have been over the last several weeks, we want to continue our commentary on what's going on in Gaza as the death rate and the injuries from the high-tech massacre, there's no other word for it, that took place yesterday as the Israelis opened fire with both tanks and snipers and drones on nearly 1,000 people who had massed around some of the aid trucks in a state of starvation. And there was essentially a massacre. There was nearly 800 people injured. And the latest count as of this morning was that there was 107 people killed, again, almost all civilians and mostly women and children, as the death rate climbs above 30,000 with well over 72,000 injured so far since the Israeli invasion of Gaza in the aftermath of the October attack by Hamas. I want to make two comments, and then we'll go on to Alexei Navalny and Ukraine. And one is that if you noted in the news, very important in understanding Alexei Navalny, if you noted in the news that began immediately after the massacre had ended in Israeli TV, this was basically a stampede of hungry people over the trucks. The Israelis shot a few people, but most of the people were killed because of the stampede. And had the Palestinians been better behaved and more closely regulated, this might not have happened. That's the official line that's been coming out of Israel and over most of the mainstream media, although Al Jazeera has been releasing photographs, testimonials to assert what actually happened, which is consistent with what I said yesterday and again summarizing this morning. But it's an example of how quickly and how effectively governments can shape public perception through the narrative that they then feed into the mainstream media. There's no free press any longer in the West, except on the margins. The CNNs and the BBCs and the Deutsche TVs and the French TVs and MSNBC and Fox News are basically controlled media outlets. And you see it over and over and over. So once one understands what's really going on, one can see how effectively the public is manipulated time and time again in the aftermath of an event. And when they're really good and they know that something big has happened, they begin a preparatory process to begin the conditioning of the public for an event. That, of course, is what happened as the classic example is what happened in Iraq before the invasion there and the overthrow of Saddam Hussein. There was a very careful orchestration of the news. We were told repeatedly that Saddam Hussein was a tyrant, that he killed babies and went into homes and arrested people and killed people in a horrendous manner. There was a video that was released showing soldiers going into a immature babies ward and pulling out the plugs of the incubators, and that sent shock through the Western public. And then there was weapons of mass destruction. He had weapons, and whether it was Dick Cheney or President Bush or Condoleezza Rice or Donald Rumsfeld, we can't wait till the nuclear bomb goes off. We have to attack now. Colin Powell went before the United Nations and showed evidence of weapons of mass destructions, and it was all bogus. Every bit of it. But the effect was to generate I believe, an 80% public support for the war. And when it came time to vote in the Congress, it was near unanimity in both the Senate and the House, with very few important exceptions to support the war. And the entire construct was fabricated. It's an extraordinary thing. The second point I want to make is that, and I can't show it on our Humanity Rising broadcast, so I'm going to put it in the chat so people can see it. And I encourage everyone to watch this. It's by Jewish intellectual Max Blumenthal, who is a journalist for the Gray Zone. And he's done a short, I think, 13-minute YouTube on what's wrong with the Israelis, which is brilliant. And it shows the result of the careful cultivation of the Israeli public for the degradation of Palestinians and an almost orgiastic desire for war to eliminate them entirely. I've said before that what's happening in Gaza now is not an exception. If you go back, as I did, to Cast Lead in 2008, 2009, or Protective Edge in 2015, 2016, where they just basically carpet bombed Gaza, killing tens of thousands and injuring tens of thousands of Palestinians. What's happening now is just the latest episode. And what Max Blumenthal brings out through videos taken in Israel of the cultivated frenzy that is required for people to engage in genocide. Remember the mass marches in Germany in the 1930s and in Nuremberg and other cities where there'd be tens of thousands of people in a mesmerizing, hypnotic state, shouting, "Sig Heil, Sig Heil, Sig Heil." All that is careful preparation for mass slaughter. In fact, it's required. Even in the last 24 hours, the Israelis have continued to bomb Gaza. They've continued to destroy homes and schools. The settlers have continued to expropriate more land, Palestinian land, in the West Bank, because the Israelis are in a collective state of mass hysteria. And so I urge all of you to look up Max Blumenthal, What's Wrong with the Israelis? Just Google it and watch it, and you get a sense, like what happened in the United States in preparation for the war in Iraq, as just the classic example of what the state has the power to do through the manipulation of the media. Most people have never been to Gaza. Most people have never been to Israel or Russia or Ukraine. So everything that you think you know is coming through the media. And because we want to believe the media, the New York Times, all the news that's fit to print is their tagline. So when you read something in the New York Times, you assume it's true. And to get to the point of intellectual maturity, political maturity, I would say moral maturity. So when you read something in the newspaper, or you see it on CNN or MSNBC or BBC, you don't automatically consider it to be true, but you ask a different question. Who does this serve? Who benefits from this information? Why am I watching this? What do they want me to believe? When you begin to look at the news from that perspective, you begin to liberate yourself from the propaganda machine that is manipulating, in this case, North America and Western Europe. It's a very limited media bubble about what's going on. I'll be talking more about Gaza, as you all know, as we proceed, as we begin our programs. But I would like to now turn to Alexei Navalny, who, as I said, as we speak today, completely synchronistically, is being buried, not yet. He's having his funeral in Moscow. You've all seen the news. There's been almost a frenzy of Navalny tributes from Western leaders. Note that Western leaders, Americans, British, French, not in India, not in China, not in Latin America, not in Africa. This is a media bubble around Alexei Navalny that's very specific to cultivating a certain antagonism and antipathy against Russia and Vladimir Putin. And I want all of you to go into your psyches now. Who do you hate because of what you're hearing about Alexei Navalny? Who poisoned him? Who killed him? Who repressed him? Putin. That's what you're being told. And then when asked to ask the question, what do they want you to think because of the information that you're being given? Well, it turns out that President Biden's having a really difficult time getting more money for the war in Ukraine. And what has been 24/7 since the death of Navalny several weeks ago is anti-Russian sentiment being spewed out by the mainstream media. As Biden and Ursula von der Leyen and others in the EU try to garner flagging public support for a war in Ukraine that more and more people are becoming disenchanted with. So that's the first point that I want to really emphasize coming out of what we see in Israel, is to ask ourselves the question, why are we being given this information in this form right now? What do they want us to believe? What do they want us to support? And it's within this context that I'd like to tell the story of Alexei Navalny, because he isn't who you think he is if you've been listening to the mainstream news. Alex Navalny was born in 1976, which means that he was just coming of age when the Soviet Union broke up in December of 1991. He was a teenager during those Boris Yeltsin years of turbulence as the economy collapsed, poverty was pervasive, the emerging oligarchs were taking land, all intertwined with very active CIA engagement in Russia as it was just in turmoil and in chaos. And it was during that time when Navalny came of age, and that's very important. He didn't emerge during the Soviet period, during the communist period. He emerged during the time of troubles, during the time of chaos. His first political expression was as what we would call a white supremacist. He was a skinhead, as they would say in Great Britain. He was a Russian white supremacist. He was racially oriented in his politics. He believed that Russia should allow no immigration. He felt that any of the Muslims should be treated like cockroaches. He had a YouTube, which you can see if you are so inclined, where he talked about using weapons to eliminate the Chechens, which is a Muslim minority in Chechnya, and even the Georgians, the non-Russians. He was racially opposed to any race other than the white Russians. And he was so zealous about that he was actually expelled in 2007 from a right-wing party because of his xenophobic practices. One of the ways that the CIA, through the National Endowment for Democracy, which was set up by President Reagan in 1983, is essentially a CIA front organization to support democracy around the world through destabilizing various countries through the fomenting of civil unrest. You will remember that when the Soviet Union broke up, this was in the aftermath of Mikhail Gorbachev offering the West extraordinary opportunities to eliminate nuclear weapons, to create, in fact, a common security zone from Lisbon to Vladivostok. And he had withdrawn all the Soviet troops from Eastern Europe, allowed Germany to be reunited, Eastern Europe to become independent, thinking that the Americans were going to agree. They did not. And within days of the collapse of the Soviet Union at the end of 1991, Paul Wolfowitz in the Pentagon, who was a deputy secretary of defense, released a document recommending that the United States seize the opportunity of the demise of the Soviet Union to establish what he called full spectrum dominance over the entire world. Because with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the United States had no peer enemy. And we entered into what has been called the unipolar moment. So the neoconservatives, Dick Cheney, Paul Wolfowitz, Condoleezza Rice, Victoria Nuland, who was an assistant to Dick Cheney, who's now Undersecretary of State for the Biden administration, Jake Sullivan, Anthony Blinken, that whole group believed that this was an opportunity to break up the Soviet Union, to break up Russia, and to sow dissent. So you would then, in the chaos that would ensue, the US could generate more global supremacy. So they had a number of front organizations in Moscow that were receiving large amounts of money. And Alexei Navalny was one of the people that the CIA started to support. If you don't want to believe what I'm saying, you might want to check WikiLeaks. You remember some of the troves of information that was released by WikiLeaks 10, 15 years ago, before Julian Assange was so brutally and unceremoniously, illegally arrested and detained to the present day. Part of the trove of WikiLeaks was that the Alexei Navalny was receiving serious amounts of money by the CIA, through the CIA and through NATO and through organizations in the UK. He was also involved in some trade deals, commercial deals, and these were the first cases where he contravened the law through embezzlement. He was charged with embezzlement by the French cosmetic firm Yves Roche and convicted. And then on another occasion, he was convicted of embezzlement of a forestry company that he was consulting with in Siberia. Both times he was not put in jail, but he was put on parole. But he consistently violated the parole because he didn't think that the rules applied to him. And that's one reason why he has been termed the Russian Trump. You know, the rules apply to other people, but not to me. And then it was interesting, in 2010, he was brought by Central Intelligence to Yale, where he participated in a 6-month training program for people that the Central Intelligence Agency had spotted, not just in Russia, but in different countries in Eastern Europe, different countries in Africa. They would bring to Yale University, very prestigious university, of course, people that they were cultivating as assets. And it was there that Navalny began to develop this anti-corruption crusade in Russia and began to agitate for corruption. Although having been convicted twice of embezzlement, he was hardly the right person to conduct that campaign. he ran for various offices, didn't do very well. His recognition rate was less than 2%. Most of the Russian public outside of Moscow had never heard of him, hasn't heard of him really to the present day. I can't think of a counterpart in the West. You know, we might want to think of someone like, I don't know, Marianne Williamson on the Democratic side, or the congressman who's running against Biden. You know, they're not statistically significant enough to be known by any other than a small group of followers, as Marianne Williamson has, of course, and she's known to groups like Humanity Rising. But to the folks in Kansas City or Dallas, Texas, no one of them have ever heard of this person. And similarly with Alexei Navalny. In 2021, he was on a flight from Siberia back to Moscow. He fell ill. And remarkably, given the fact that it was against his parole, the Russians allowed him to leave Russia and go to Germany for treatment, which was a real puzzle because the assertion was that he was poisoned by Vladimir Putin. But it was Putin that let him go. So if, as Putin said later, listen, if I wanted to poison someone, I would have done it. It wasn't of interest to me, this Alexei Navalny. Because from Putin's point of view, Alexei Navalny was of statistical insignificance. The real opponent, just so everybody knows, to Vladimir Putin are the communists, the Communist Party. The Communist Party consistently gets 20, 30, sometimes 35% of the vote. They are the counterpart to Vladimir Putin. And Navalny is negligible. But the CIA was very carefully cultivating his image as an anti-Putin critic in the West, using that as a way, among many other ways, to cultivate the public into an increasingly anti-Russian, anti-Putin orientation, which I'll get to in just a moment. But it's what I want to tease out is doesn't look like he was poisoned. He had a concoction, actually, according to his blood samples, of various chemicals and drugs in his body. He wasn't a healthy man. But was interesting, for those of you who've seen the documentary on Navalny, after he got out of the hospital, he went down to the Black Forest in southern Germany. And there they quickly created two documentaries, one called Putin's Palace, and the other one, Navalny, which were all funded by the Central Intelligence Agency, packaged, and then distributed in the West. Navalny went back and had so egregiously violated his probation from both his embezzlement convictions that the Russian courts switched from keeping him on, allowing him to stay on parole, to putting him in prison, which would happen in any country, anywhere in the world, when you consistently violate parole. What is remarkable about Alexei Navalny is that he wasn't put in prison years ago. That's what's remarkable. And the reason is that he wasn't a threat to Putin. And it's now within this context that I want to turn to say a little more about the man Putin that we all are being told to hate. And I know this is going to make many of you uncomfortable because we're so conditioned to hate Putin, largely because of our support of Navalny. I want everybody to think about that. Why do you hate Putin? Well, because he's a tyrant. He kills people. He's engaging in mass slaughter in Ukraine, and whatever else that you can think about Putin. But again, the reality from someone who spent many, many years in Russia, as you all know, is very, very different. And is one of the reasons why in Russia, in independent polling, Vladimir Putin, who's been in power for, I think it's 24, 25 years, has had consistently approval ratings of between 70 and 80, 90%. And I'd like to share the thematic approach to his biography so that you can understand better why Alexei Navalny was of no account in the Russian context, even though he was created as this paragon in the West, and why the Russians so devotedly support Putin, and why Putin has just defeated the United States and the NATO alliance in Ukraine, because that's what's been happening in Ukraine. The Russians have won, even though you don't hear about this in the news. And I want to explain. When Putin came to power as the fifth prime minister under President Boris Yeltsin, who presided in the Soviet Union between 1992 and essentially the end of 1999, right at the beginning of 2000 when Yeltsin abruptly resigned. That was an extraordinary period of turbulence, corruption, foreign intrigue by the Central Intelligence Agency and British and NATO intelligence agencies seeking to break up Russia. And Putin was a young man. He was in his late 40s with no previous elected experience. Certainly, he'd been in the KGB for 16 years, so he knew the intelligence. He had served briefly as the head of the FSB, with the KGB that had been reorganized and renamed FSB under Boris Yeltsin. And then he was tapped to become a prime minister when literally they had run out of options and couldn't think of anyone else. Nobody expected him to last. He was very diminutive in stature. He very soft-spoken, and the big oligarchs that had taken extraordinary power and carved up this vast landmass thought that he was just going to be easily bought off and dealt with, and then they were going to have an election, and then the big boys were going to decide. Chechnya revolted. If you remember the events of 2000, 2001. So it was a critical mess in Russia. Soviet Union had just collapsed. As I said, there was poverty, all kinds of chaos. I was there. It was extraordinary. There was no governing power on the streets. And Putin's prime minister number 5. He was very strategic. He took a long view and began a very slow process of building Russia from the ground up. He had to come to terms with the oligarchs who were stronger than he was. But when one of them, the wealthiest and the most powerful, took him on, a guy by the name of Kardovsky, he had him imprisoned, tried, and put away. And that shocked the oligarchs. That shocked the oligarchs. So within a year of coming into power, Putin realized that this was a highly complicated situation with much foreign intrigue, and that he had to be forceful but extremely careful. One of the things he did, which was really a stroke of genius, is he began to rehabilitate and reanimate the Russian Orthodox Church, which had essentially been forced underground for the 70 years of Soviet control since 1917 through the year 2000. The Russian Orthodox Church was decrepit. There was very little spirit, and Putin began to rebuild the Russian Orthodox churches. He began to rebuild the monasteries. He began to rebuild the patriarchy. He began to speak to the Russian people about the mother Russia, about the Russian soul. He was bringing back Soloviev and the various 19th century Russian theologians. And that began to just bring Russia in to a new sense of who it could be as the Soviet Union and the totalitarianism of the Bolsheviks fell away, and Russia had a chance to rebuild. The economy started to improve. He began to consolidate control over the oligarchs. He reached out to President Clinton, as Boris Yeltsin did, and said, listen, we're no longer communist. We would like to join NATO. We would like to join the EU and become part of the West. The Americans said no. And in fact, it was Clinton that, under Boris Yeltsin, had started the eastward march of NATO to consolidate US control, NATO control over all of Eastern Europe, all the land that the Soviet Union had given up under Gorbachev. So Putin not only had to rebuild Russia, he had the United States coming across Eastern Europe to his western flank. He repeatedly asked the Americans to honor the agreement that they had with Gorbachev, and reiterated multiple times, we're no longer communist. We'd like to join NATO and the EU. And he was rebuffed. So Putin had to govern Russia, knowing that the neocon strategy of US expansion and full spectrum dominance was on the march, including constant machinations inside Russia by Central Intelligence and NATO intelligence to destabilize the Russian government with the stated purpose of breaking up Russia. They had plans to break Russia up into 5 different nations so that the Western powers could come in and take the commodities. Russia is in terms of resources and commodities, it's the richest country in the world. Then in 2008, after 8 years in power, in Bucharest, President George Bush Jr. announced that they were going to take Ukraine next. Now, when you take Ukraine, you're moving beyond the Warsaw Treaty Organization into the former Soviet Union, into the heart of Russia. And it was at that point that Putin, after 8 years trying to develop friendship with the West, said that's not going to happen. If you invade Ukraine, we will retake Crimea, and there will probably be war. Ukraine should be neutral. And if it stays neutral, everything is fine. And at that time, in 2008, the government in Ukraine was neutral. Now, I offer this big picture because if you're dealing with the world at that level, a white supremacist like Alexei Navalny running around Moscow, funded by the CIA, talking about corruption, is like a mosquito on the buffalo's back. That's why I am saying that there's no substance to this notion that Navalny was some big opponent to Vladimir Putin. He was statistically negligible and was of no account except in the Western construction, in the Western mind, as the West, seeing that Putin was a force to be reckoned with, was doing everything it could to undermine him. And Navalny was just one of those aspects that was used mostly in the Western media to kind of create a major opponent to Putin that was somehow Putin was concerned with. Putin has never been concerned with Alexei Navalny. That's why he let him go after he got sick on the plane. It was of no account. No account. And then Central Intelligence Agency continued to work very specifically in Ukraine. And I would refer everyone to a New York Times major piece that came out about 2 weeks ago, talking about the history of the Central Intelligence Agency in Ukraine. It's an extraordinary read. How the Central Intelligence came in specifically to destabilize Ukraine. And it was, this, again, the National Endowment for Democracy, according to Victoria Nuland, that put $5 billion into the destabilization of Ukraine. And that resulted in what they called the color revolution, the Maidan revolution of 2015. And you've seen the documentary done by Oliver Stone of the Winter of Fire, I think it's called. I saw it at the time. And what it was cultivating is that this was a people's revolution, and they were going to overthrow Yanukovych, this tyrant. And his crime was that he was maintaining neutrality between Russia and the West. So he had to be overthrown, and he was overthrown. And then what came in was an anti-Russian government. And if you've seen the YouTube, Victoria Nuland was caught live on tape talking about who they had picked to take over when Yanukovych was thrown out, and sure enough, they all came into power. And you can read the CIA article in the New York Times. The Central Intelligence Agency then came immediately in a more enhanced way, started to work with the Ukrainians to foment war against the Donbass in eastern Ukraine. It's all there in the New York Times, one of the most extraordinary exposés, and one wonders why it's coming out now. Think about thought. With everything you read, ask the question, why do they want me to know this? Who benefits from this information? Because there's no neutral news. Somebody somewhere wanted you to read this. Why? Maybe tomorrow I'll speculate on why the New York Times, at this moment of the collapse of Ukraine, is releasing information about the deep CIA involvement with the Ukrainians. They had these bases. They built 12 bases with deep underground bunkers on the borders with Donbass. And one of the things that's happening is that the Russians are overrunning those as we speak, as the Ukrainian forces collapse on their eastern front. And then, as you know, the situation continued to deteriorate as a result of these CIA Ukrainian initiatives, and the Ukrainians that the CIA was working with were all basically the Azov Brigade, the neo-Nazi militias that have been very prominent in Ukraine and continue to fight in the war as part of the neo-Nazi component to what is taking place in Ukraine with deep CIA connections. And then, as we all know, in 2022, 2 years ago this month, on the 24th of February, 2022, Putin went in, not as an invasion, but in a limited military strike to secure Crimea. When the Germans invaded Poland in 1939, they had 2 million men. When the Russians came in February of 2022, they had 190,000. There was never any attempt to take over Ukraine, but they needed to secure, as you've seen on all the maps that I've shown previously, they needed to secure land bridge to Crimea, which they'd taken in 2015 after the US coup that had been organized under the Obama administration by Vice President Joe Biden through Victoria Nuland and Jake Sullivan and Anthony Blinken, who were part of his team at that time. So when he became president, that same team, and then that's when they went to war. It's an extraordinary thing. And if you think about what Putin's dealing with now, he's got the United States of America that spends $1 trillion a year on its defense budget. Russia only spends $50 billion. So he's up against an enemy that's spending 20 times more than he is on the most sophisticated weaponry in the world. And then you've got the other members of the NATO alliance, all with sophisticated weaponry, and they're all pumping it into Ukraine. US forces are there. British forces are there. NATO forces are there. Everything that's going on in Ukraine is being coordinated out of Langley, Virginia, and the big central command out of Germany. the surveillance of the satellites. So the Ukrainians have had access to the most sophisticated US weaponry and surveillance capacity possible. And the Russians had to somehow deal with that. And if you read the speeches that Putin made to the Russian people after the war began, he was calling up the Russian memory of how they took on Napoleon in 1812, how they took on Hitler in 1941, and now how they needed to take on the United States in the NATO onslaught in 2022. And they were going to win because they were going to do exactly what they've done before. The Russians are masters at what they call aggressive attrition. They're not spectacular. They don't seize land or try to take over cities and do the theatrics of war. They just wear the enemy down. And in fact, their incursion into Ukraine in February, March of 2022 so destabilized the Ukrainian army that Zelensky called Putin and said, let's have a peace agreement. So they generated a peace agreement. And this has been spoken about by in terms of the German negotiators, the Ukrainian negotiators, the Russian negotiators, and they agreed very quickly that Ukraine would become neutral, Russia would withdraw from Crimea, and they would settle the Donbass over the subsequent years. And in fact, they'd written out a draft agreement. And they were so sure that the peace agreement was going to hold that Putin unilaterally withdrew the Russian troops from the outskirts of Kiev. And it is a sign of good faith, back to Gorbachev. Sign of good faith. We're going to withdraw all our troops from Eastern Europe. That's what the Russians did around May of 2022. And they were in Istanbul for final discussions hosted and brokered by Turkish President Erdogan. And who shows up but Boris Johnson, the UK Prime Minister, and said, no, this isn't going to happen. The White House does not want this to happen because President Biden and Anthony Blinken and Victoria Nuland did not want peace. And they blew it up. So Zelensky and the Ukrainians flew from Istanbul back to Kiev. And the war continued because what the Americans said to the Ukrainians, we'll give you as much weaponry as you need. We're going to support you 100%. You can take on the Russians and you can take it all back. So all of a sudden, the Russians, Putin, and Gerasimov, the defense minister, Shukin, the commander in the Ukraine forces, realized that they had a long war. And they had to deal with the most sophisticated weaponry in the history of the world. So they just began to retool the Russian economy that was under siege by the sanctions. Every conceivable sanction has been put on Russia. The latest of them, and as a result of Alexei Navalny's death, more sanctions are now being put on Russians. So in the midst of a war, international sanctions, Putin's got to guide Russia into how do you retool the economy so you can mobilize a war effort that could defeat the combined power of the United States, NATO, using Ukraine as a proxy. And that's exactly what they did. Now, within this context, I want to just make one detailed point about the great counteroffensive that was heralded by Victoria Nuland last June, in June of 2023, when, because the Russians in 2022, in the fall of 2022 and early 2023, the Russians had to give up Kharkov and Kherson. They evacuated, so that they went kind of east of the Dnieper River, so they gave up land. And the Americans thought, aha, we've got them on the run. Send in the troops. And that's exactly what the Russians wanted them to do. I mentioned yesterday that if you consider that the Palestinians have had 30,000 people killed, that's the equivalent per capita to 120,000 Israelis, 4.4 million Americans, and 480,000 Ukrainians. You know how many Ukrainian troops have been killed since the beginning of the war? Latest estimates are 440,000 troops have been killed. As I've said, the Russians have never been beaten in large-scale war. They beat Napoleon, and by the time Napoleon left Russia, he had less than 20% of the men who went in. No one can remember any of the battles. The Russians just wore him down. And a combination of the winter and their ceaseless attacks along the retreat decimated the French. And within a year or so, Napoleon lost the Battle of Waterloo and was seen no more except on the island of Elba. Same thing happened to the Germans. The Germans came in and the Russians retreated. Then came the Great Battle of Stalingrad, and then the Germans were forced out. And the Germans had only a fraction of the men and materiel leaving Russia as they had going into Russia. And the same things happened to the United States and NATO. It's been said from the beginning that the US and Europe are going to fight to the last Ukrainian, and that's pretty much what they've done. The Ukrainians have gone through 3 armies, and now there's nobody left except young boys without training. And they're fighting an enemy, which I said 2 years ago, that cannot be beat. Ukraine has a population of about 60 million, although upwards of 15 million have left Ukraine. Russia has a population of well over 300 million. Ukraine is a new country. It was only formed in 1991. It has never been a country before. Its military has no depth. Its commanders have no experience. President Zelensky was a comedian. The Russians came out of World War II having lost 25 million people, but they defeated the Germans in the end. They've got a military and a military doctrine that goes back centuries. The depth of the Russian military is without peer. And that's why they've defeated the United States and NATO. You probably heard about the Battle of Bakhmut at the end of 2021, early 2022. You may have not heard of the Battle of Avdeyevka that just completed, which was the major battle of this war that the Ukrainians were trying to keep at all costs. And the Russians just wore them down. Just wore them down. So finally, there's been 60, 70,000 Russian troops killed and nearly 450,000 Ukrainians. Let me just make a little discursus here. They estimate that about 10,000 Ukrainian civilians have been killed on both the Russian and Ukrainian side, and about another 10,000 wounded. So you have 20,000 against 450,000 civilian and military. In Gaza, it's the exact reverse. It's 100,000 civilians killed or wounded, and maybe 2,000, 1,500 actual certifiable Hamas troops that have been killed, just to give you a measure of the difference between war and genocide. So the Russians have been extraordinarily prudent. There have been casualties. You know, occasionally there's been a hospital or a school that's been destroyed, but not many. This has been a pitched battle between armies. And obviously civilians are caught in the crossfire as they were in Avdeyevka or Bakhmut or the different towns and so forth and so on. But the civilian casualties in Ukraine have been among the lowest in modern war. That's just a fact. You take the wars that the US fought in Afghanistan and Vietnam and Iraq, etc. It's more like Gaza. Many more times civilians killed in military, largely because the United States was going against countries that basically didn't have much of a military. But now they're fighting the Russians. And the Russians have won. And the Ukrainians are in retreat on every part of the land. The fighting line, which stretches for about 1,000 kilometers, different parts of Ukraine. They had just fired, Zelensky had just fired his general Zaluzhny, and he's got a new general named Syrskyi, who is out of his depth and doesn't know quite what to do. They're doing what the Wehrmacht did as it retreated from the Russian advance in World War II. The Wehrmacht was defeated so dramatically that it couldn't come back and build bunkered defense lines. It had to do cluster defenses. So that's what the Ukrainians are doing now in Ukraine. They're trying to figure out how to create defensive lines like the Wehrmacht did. And the Russians are just inexorably advancing. And so it's now a matter of time. Now, this is where I want to make an important point, and I'll draw this to a close, even though I have much more to say about this subject. But I want to make two concluding points. Nowhere in the West, not in Washington, not in Paris, not in London, not in Berlin, is anybody talking about negotiation, peace agreement. Nobody's talking about negotiation. They're only talking about how do we get further mobilization of more young Ukrainians to develop somehow a fourth army against the Russians while the Ukrainians are in retreat. How do we get more billions of dollars to support a military in a state of collapse? And then Macron, president of France, says last week, let's send in NATO troops. Let's go in ourselves. And he called a meeting in Paris. And the other leaders in the EU and in NATO said, no, we can't go to war. We can't all just go to war in Ukraine against Russia. And then 2 nights ago, Putin made a speech to the parliament in Russia, his State of the Union address, which was reported that Putin threatens nuclear weapons. I listened to the speech. He didn't say any such thing. Remember, when you hear something, ask yourself, why are they telling me this? What do they want me to think? What Putin in fact said, and I would encourage all of you to, you can Google his speech. What he in fact said was that if NATO comes into Ukraine and the armies of Western Europe come into Ukraine, they will radically enhance the danger of a nuclear exchange. That's what he said back in 2020 and 2021 and 2022. You don't want to do this. Putin did everything he could to avoid that war. And finally, when there was literally no other option, he went in a very limited way. But as offered to negotiate, as he did with Zelensky, within a couple months of his initial limited military incursion, and was even willing to give the Crimea and everything back as long as Ukraine would be neutral. The United States doesn't want a Ukraine. They want it all because they want to break up Russia. So Putin said in his speech, if NATO is going to escalate at that level, you will proportionally escalate the danger of nuclear war. He wasn't threatening anything. He was making a statement of obvious fact. If the US started to send troops into the Ukraine, along with French, German troops, the Russians are not going to back down. It would quickly escalate to a nuclear exchange. That's obvious, except to someone like Macron. It's an extraordinary thing. It's an extraordinary thing. The recklessness of the West at a time when all they could need to do is negotiate a settlement. But there is no willingness anywhere in the Western alliance to do the obvious. And meanwhile, the Ukrainians are being completely destroyed. It's shocking that per capita, as many Ukrainians have died in their military as civilians have been slaughtered in Gaza in the last 5 months. Where are they going to get more troops? How are they going to spend the billions that the Americans and the EU want to keep giving the Ukrainians? There's nothing left. This is a crime, what's happening to Ukraine. And it's not because of Russia. It's because of the United States and NATO insisting on taking all of Ukraine and breaking up Russia. And Putin has not only rebuilt Russia, but has taken on that Western alliance and has defeated us. Which leads me to the final point I want to make about what's going to happen next. All this time, Putin has been working with Xi Jinping in China, Modi in India, Ramaphosa in South Africa, Lula in Brazil, the BRICS countries, and other countries, Iran, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, other countries that are now coming into the BRICS alliance. And they've all gone off the dollar. So the US dollar, which has been primus for 75 years since the end of the Second World War as the currency of exchange around the world, and on the base of which the US economy has been strong, the US dollar now is going to be radically devaluated. And when that happens, the US economy is going to collapse. And it will be unable to sustain the 800 military bases that it has all over the world. So when we think of Ukraine, we're dealing with an extraordinary tragedy. And the Americans, eventually, they may do it this summer, are just going to walk away. Like the Americans walked away from Iraq. And we saw last year the way they walked away from Afghanistan. They just walked away, leaving decades of carnage. And now Trump and the Republicans don't want to give Biden any more money. And even if they gave him the money, it's not going to do any good. And people are starting to wake up to that. And that's, circle back, one hypothesis as to why the New York Times ran this article. It's being theorized that the CIA is about ready to quit Ukraine. The director of the CIA has been to Ukraine 10 times in the last 18 months. The last time was just a week ago. What's he doing there? How's Central Intelligence dealing with the collapse of the Ukrainian front line? Are they destroying documents? Who is behind the leaks in the New York Times? Why is this information being put out now? I said in my teach-ins, and with this I close, 2 years ago, that not only was Russia going to win, but that this was going to be the death knell of Pax Americana. I think the combination of the disaster of Ukraine and the unmitigated disaster of the war on Gaza for the United States is that the rest of the world now is seeing clearly who we actually are and are moving away. Ukraine, in my view, will go down in history as the death knell of the American empire, from which the United States will never recover. And the fact that simultaneously with what it's done, using the Ukrainian people in a pointless, futile attempt to break up Russia, it has perpetrated genocide in Gaza, is going to speed the decline and demise of the imperium even faster. As the Chinese would say, the mandate from heaven is leaving the imperium. And in this case, it's moving east to Asia. So the destruction of Ukraine is not only a tragedy for Ukraine, the breadbasket of Europe, the mother of Europe, the origin of Europe, but it's the death knell of Pax Americana. And that should make us all intensely sad at the complete wastage of resources and talent and people. And creative genius that could have been spent so much more productively had the Americans embraced Gorbachev and ended the Cold War, had the Americans embraced Yeltsin and Putin and brought Russia into the EU and NATO, there had been no war in Ukraine. And it's out of this strategic, devastating mistake that a whole new world order is emerging that will replace American primacy with hopefully a more egalitarian and inclusive global system. So thank you, everyone. We'll bring this to a close at the moment. I'll jump on the after chat for a few minutes. I thank you for your attention. I know for those of you who hate Russia and hate Putin, this has been difficult for you to take in. I just want to acknowledge that. When you hear the news, never believe it. Always ask, why do they want me to hear this? What do they want me to believe? Who's benefiting? Thank you, everyone. See you next week. See you in the after chat. Bye for now.